You lie awake at 3 in the morning, your mind racing through tomorrow's deadlines, next week's presentations, and problems that may never even happen. Every day brings a fresh wave of anxiety that follows you from the office to your dinner table, robbing you of peace and joy in the very life you're working so hard to build. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying why some people thrive under pressure, while others crumble under the weight of worry. Through my research with thousands of individuals, from struggling salespeople to Fortune 500 executives, I discovered that stress and worry aren't inevitable parts of success. They're learned habits that can be unlearned. What I'm going to share with you today will transform how you approach every challenge, turning your anxious energy into focused action and your sleepless nights into peaceful rest. The principles I developed didn't just help millions of people build better careers. They helped them reclaim their lives from the tyranny of constant worry. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing insights, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to break free from stress and worry forever. I want you to understand something about me that most people never knew. I wasn't born confident, successful, or worry-free. In fact, I was probably one of the most anxious young men you could have found in all of Missouri. Growing up on our family farm, I lived in constant fear. Fear of poverty, fear of failure, fear that I'd never amount to anything more than another struggling farmer watching the seasons dictate his fate. My father worked from dawn to dusk, his hands permanently stained with soil and worry lines etched deep into his weathered face. I watched him pace the floors during bad harvest years, calculating and recalculating numbers that never seemed to add up to enough. The anxiety in our household was as thick as the summer humidity, and I absorbed every bit of it into my young bones. When I made the decision to leave Missouri for New York City to pursue my dreams, I was terrified. I wrote a letter to my father that I never had the courage to send, confessing that I was scared I'd fail, scared I'd embarrass our family name, scared I'd prove that farm boys like me had no business chasing big city dreams. That letter sat in my drawer for years, a testament to the paralyzing worry that governed my early life. My first attempts at public speaking were disasters. I would lie awake for nights before any presentation, my stomach churning with anxiety, imagining every possible way I could humiliate myself. During my early speeches, my hands would shake so violently I couldn't hold my notes steady. My voice would crack, my mind would go blank, and I'd stumble through words like a man walking through quicksand. But it was during one particularly awful speaking engagement that I had my first breakthrough. I was so nervous, so consumed with worry about what the audience thought of me, that I completely forgot my prepared remarks. In desperation, I started talking about my own fears, my own struggles with anxiety. Something magical happened. The audience leaned in. They connected with my vulnerability more than they ever had with my polished presentations. That night, I realized something profound. I wasn't alone in my worry. Every person in that room carried their own invisible burden of anxiety. The difference between those who succeeded and those who remained trapped wasn't the absence of worry. It was how they chose to handle it. I began studying successful people with the intensity of a scientist examining specimens under a microscope. I watched, I listened, I asked questions. What I discovered changed everything. The most successful people I met weren't worry-free. They had simply learned to dance with their anxiety instead of being paralyzed by it. This revelation became the foundation of everything I would later teach. I realized that worry wasn't my enemy. It was my teacher. Every sleepless night, every anxious moment, every fear that gripped my chest was showing me exactly what I needed to learn to become the person I wanted to be. The young farm boy who once couldn't sleep for worry about tomorrow had found his life's mission, helping others break free from the chains of anxiety that had once bound me so tightly. After years of studying my own anxiety and observing thousands of others in my classes, I began to see patterns emerge like constellations in the night sky. Worry, I discovered, wasn't one monolithic monster. It was actually a collection of different creatures, each with its own characteristics and weaknesses. I started categorizing the worries I encountered, drawing charts and diagrams that helped me understand this invisible force that had controlled so much of my early life. What I found was revolutionary. Most people were fighting shadows, wrestling with phantoms that existed only in their imagination. The first type of worry I identified was what I called yesterday's regrets, the endless mental replay of past mistakes, failed relationships, and missed opportunities. I watched people torture themselves over decisions they could never change, conversations they wished they'd handled differently, and chances they'd let slip away. These individuals were prisoners of their own history, unable to move forward because they were forever looking backward. The second category was tomorrow's fears, anxiety about things that hadn't happened yet and might never happen at all. These were the people who lay awake imagining job losses, relationship failures, health crises, and financial disasters that existed only in their worried minds. They were so busy preparing for catastrophes that they forgot to live in the present moment where life actually happens. But the most destructive type of worry I discovered was what I called the unchangeable storm, people exhausting themselves, fighting against circumstances completely beyond their control. They worried about the weather ruining their outdoor wedding, the economy affecting their investments, or other people's opinions about their choices. They were like swimmers fighting against a riptide, wearing themselves out instead of learning. To work with the current, the revelation that changed everything for me was this. I calculated that roughly 40% of our worries are about things that will never happen, 30% are about past decisions that cannot be changed, 22% are about trivial matters that don't really matter in the long run, and only 8% are about legitimate concerns that we can actually do something about. This meant that 92% of our worry is completely wasted energy, mental and emotional resources, squandered on battles that either don't exist or can't be won. When I shared this discovery with my students, I watched the relief wash over their faces like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. But understanding the anatomy of worry was only the beginning. I realized there was a crucial difference between productive concern and destructive worry. Concern motivates us to take action. It says, "There's a problem here, let's solve it." Worry, on the other hand, paralyzes us with endless circular thinking that leads nowhere except deeper into anxiety. I learned to ask myself a simple question that became my lifeline. Is this something I can do something about right now? If the answer was yes, I would take action immediately. If the answer was no, I would consciously choose to release that concern from my mental grasp. The moment I understood that worry was a choice, not an inevitable response to life's challenges, everything began to change. I wasn't at the mercy of my anxious thoughts anymore. I had tools, strategies, and most importantly, hope that there was a better way to live. I'll never forget the ship voyage that changed my entire philosophy about time and worry. I was traveling across the Atlantic, and during a tour of the vessel, the captain showed me something that would revolutionize how I thought about living. He took me down to the engine room and pointed to the massive steel doors that could seal off different compartments of the ship. "Mr. Carnegie," he said, "these bulkheads can be closed instantly from the bridge. If we hit an iceberg or face any emergency, we can seal off the damaged section and save the rest of the ship. The water can't spread beyond that compartment." As I stood there listening to the rhythmic thrum of the engines, a profound realization washed over me. What if I could apply this same principle to my life? What if I could create watertight compartments in my mind, sealing off yesterday's regrets and tomorrow's fears, focusing only on today's challenges and opportunities? That night in my cabin, I developed what I came to call the day-tight compartment philosophy. I realized that most of my anxiety came from mental time travel, constantly visiting the past to replay my mistakes, or journeying into the future to imagine disasters that might never occur. I was living everywhere except in the only time that actually existed, right now. I began practicing a simple but powerful exercise. Each morning I would mentally close the bulkhead doors on yesterday, whatever mistakes I had made, whatever opportunities I had missed, whatever pain I had experienced. I would acknowledge it, learn from it if possible, and then seal it off. Yesterday was a closed compartment that could no longer flood today with regret. Similarly, I learned to close the bulkhead doors on tomorrow. All my fears about future failures, potential disasters, and imagined catastrophes were locked away in their own compartment. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but I refused to let tomorrow's troubles leak into today's reality. This left me free to focus all my energy, creativity, and attention on the only day I could actually influence. Today, not yesterday, which was beyond my power to change, not tomorrow, which hadn't arrived yet. Just today, this 24-hour period where I could make decisions, take actions, and create the life I wanted. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the weight of past regrets and future fears, I felt light, focused, and empowered. When I concentrated all my mental resources on today's challenges, I found I had more than enough strength and wisdom to handle whatever came my way. I started carrying a small card in my wallet with these words, "Today is the tomorrow you worried about yesterday, and all is well." Whenever I felt my mind beginning to drift into the dangerous waters of past or future, I would read those words and bring myself back to the present moment. This principle became so central to my philosophy that I began teaching it to everyone who would listen. I watched students transform before my eyes as they learned to live in day-tight compartments. The businessman who was paralyzed by fear of future market crashes began making confident decisions based on today's information. The mother worried about her children's distant futures started enjoying their childhood today. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of this principle was what it taught me about the nature of problems themselves. I discovered that most problems, when confined to their actual time frame, are manageable. It's only when we allow them to spread across multiple time zones that they become overwhelming. Today became my sanctuary, my kingdom, my sphere of influence. And in that single day, I found everything I needed to build a life free from the tyranny of worry. One of the most pivotal conversations of my life happened over coffee with Willis Carrier, the brilliant engineer who invented air conditioning. I had sought him out because I'd heard he had an unusual approach to solving seemingly impossible problems, and I was desperate to learn his secret. "Dale," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "when I'm faced with a problem that seems overwhelming, I follow a simple three-step process that has never failed me." I leaned forward, pen in hand, ready to capture whatever wisdom this genius was about to share. "First," he continued, "I analyze the situation fearlessly and figure out what the worst possible outcome could be. I don't sugarcoat it or pretend. It's not that bad. I look at the absolute worst-case scenario with clear eyes." This struck me as counterintuitive. Most people, myself included, tried to avoid thinking about worst-case scenarios, believing it would only increase our anxiety. "Second," Carrier said, "I reconcile myself to accepting that worst-case scenario if I have to. I make peace with it. Mentally and emotionally, I tell myself, if this is what happens, I can live with it." Again, this seemed backwards to everything I'd been taught about positive thinking and optimism. Third, from that point on, I calmly devote all my energy to improving upon the worst that I've already accepted mentally. As he explained this process, something clicked in my mind. By accepting the worst possible outcome first, he removed the paralyzing fear that prevented clear thinking. Once he'd made peace with the worst case, his mind was free to work on solutions. Instead of spinning in circles of anxiety, I was so intrigued that I asked him for a real example. He told me about a time when his company had installed a cleaning system in a factory, but the system wasn't working properly and was actually damaging the engines it was supposed to clean. The company was threatening to sue for $20,000, a fortune in those days that could have bankrupted his young business. Carrier applied his formula. First, he identified the worst case. His company would be sued, lose the case, and have to pay the full $20,000, which might destroy his business. Second, he mentally accepted this possibility, telling himself he could start over if necessary. Third, with his mind now calm and clear, he focused on finding solutions. The result was remarkable. Free from the paralyzing fear of failure, he was able to think creatively. He developed improvements to the system that not only solved the original problem, but made it work better than anyone had imagined. Instead of losing $20,000, his company received additional orders worth far more than the potential lawsuit. I was so excited by this approach that I immediately began testing it on my own worries. I had been agonizing over a business decision that kept me awake at night. Following Carrier's formula, I first identified the worst case. The venture could fail completely, and I could lose my investment and look foolish to my colleagues. Then, I forced myself to accept this possibility. I told myself, if this happens, I'll survive. I'll learn from the experience and try something else. My reputation will recover, and I'll be wiser for having tried. The moment I truly accepted this. Worst case scenario, something miraculous happened. The crushing weight of anxiety lifted from my chest. My mind, no longer consumed with fear, began generating creative solutions and alternatives I hadn't seen before. I discovered that acceptance isn't resignation, it's liberation. When you stop fighting the possibility of failure, you free up enormous mental and emotional energy that can be redirected toward creating success. This formula became one of my most powerful tools for helping others overcome paralyzing worry. I watched student after student transform their relationship with problems by learning to face their fears directly, accept the worst possibilities, and then channel their energy into improvement rather than anxiety. The magic wasn't in avoiding problems or pretending they didn't exist. The magic was in accepting that problems are part of life, making peace with that reality, and then getting to work on solutions with a clear, untroubled mind. There's a letter I received many years ago that I've kept in my desk drawer ever since. Not because it brought me joy, but because it taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my life. It was from a former business partner, and every word dripped with anger and accusation. He blamed me for the failure of our joint venture, questioned my integrity, and made it clear he considered me his enemy. My first instinct was to fight back. I spent weeks crafting angry responses in my mind, building cases for why I was right and he was wrong, collecting evidence of his own mistakes and shortcomings. I was ready for war, prepared to defend my reputation and prove my innocence at any cost, but something stopped me from sending that first furious reply. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was a moment of clarity, but I realized I was about to pour gasoline on a fire that was already consuming too much of my mental energy. I was letting this conflict steal my sleep, my peace of mind, and my focus on building my future. That's when I made a decision that changed everything. Instead of fighting against this situation, I would cooperate with it. Not because I agreed with his accusations, but because I recognized that some battles aren't worth winning if the victory costs you your peace of mind. I wrote him a different kind of letter. I acknowledged that our partnership hadn't worked out, as either of us had hoped. I took responsibility for my part in the failure without attacking him for his. I wished him well in his future endeavors and closed the door on our professional relationship with dignity intact. The response I received surprised me. His next letter was completely different in tone, appreciative, even apologetic. He admitted that his anger had been driven more by disappointment than by my actual behavior. Our relationship never fully recovered, but the destructive conflict ended, and I learned something profound about the power of cooperation over opposition. This experience taught me to distinguish between two very different approaches to life's inevitable conflicts and setbacks. Opposition means fighting against circumstances we cannot change, burning our energy in futile resistance. Cooperation means working with reality as it is, not as we wish it were, and finding ways to move forward constructively. I began applying this principle to every frustrating situation in my life. When a speaking engagement was canceled at the last minute, instead of raging about the inconvenience and lost income, I used the unexpected free time to work on new material. When a publishing deal fell through, instead of cursing the publisher's stupidity, I used their feedback to improve my manuscript. The most dramatic example came during the Great Depression. Like everyone else, I watched my income plummet and my opportunities disappear. I could have spent my energy bemoaning the economic catastrophe and waiting for things to return to normal. Instead, I chose to cooperate with the new reality. I realized that during tough economic times, people needed hope and practical guidance more than ever. I redesigned my courses to address the specific anxieties and challenges people were facing. I lowered my fees to make them accessible to struggling individuals. I created new programs focused on building confidence and resilience during uncertain times. The result was remarkable. While many businesses failed during those difficult years, mine grew stronger. By cooperating with the harsh economic reality instead of fighting against it, I found opportunities that wouldn't have existed in good times. This principle applies to everything from personal relationships to career setbacks to health challenges. When we waste our energy fighting against unchangeable circumstances, we have nothing left for finding solutions and creating opportunities. But when we accept reality and work with it, we discover resources and possibilities we never knew existed. I learned that cooperation isn't about being passive or giving up on your goals. It's about being smart enough to recognize when you're swimming against a current that's stronger than you are. Sometimes the fastest way to reach your destination is to stop fighting the river and start using its power to carry you forward. I once spent 3 agonizing months trying to decide whether to accept a lucrative speaking engagement that would require me to travel extensively for 6 weeks. I made list after list of pros and cons, consulted friends and advisors, and changed my mind daily. The opportunity eventually went to someone else, but the real tragedy wasn't the lost income. It was the 3 months of mental torture I put myself through by refusing to make a decision. That experience taught me something crucial. Indecision is one of the greatest sources of anxiety in human life. When we postpone making choices, we don't eliminate stress, we multiply it. Every unmade decision becomes a mental burden we carry, growing heavier with each passing day. I realized that my inability to make decisions quickly had become my greatest weakness. While I was paralyzed by analysis, life was passing me by. Opportunities disappeared, relationships suffered, and my confidence eroded with each delayed choice. I was living in a constant state of mental suspension, never fully committed to any path forward. The breakthrough came when I developed what I called my fact-gathering formula. I gave myself a strict time limit for collecting information about any decision, usually no more than a week for major choices, and no more than a day for smaller ones. During this period, I would gather facts systematically, consulting reliable sources and trusted advisors. But here's the crucial part. Once my fact-gathering deadline arrived, I would make the decision based on the information I had, even if it wasn't perfect or complete. I learned that waiting for perfect information is like waiting for perfect weather. It never comes, and meanwhile, the seasons of opportunity pass you by. I remember sitting in a restaurant one evening, facing a particularly difficult career decision. I was offered a position that would triple my income, but require me to give up my independence and work for someone else's organization. I grabbed a napkin and drew a simple decision tree, listing the key factors and their likely outcomes. Within 30 minutes, I had my answer. The financial security was appealing, but my independence was worth more to me than any salary. I turned down the offer that very night and never looked back. More importantly, I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks because the mental burden of indecision was finally lifted. I discovered that the quality of a decision is far less important than we imagine, but the act of deciding is absolutely critical to our peace of mind. A mediocre decision that we commit to completely will almost always produce better results than a perfect decision that we implement half-heartedly because we're still second-guessing ourselves. This principle became central to my teaching because I watched so many students torture themselves with prolonged indecision. I met people who had been thinking about changing careers for years, couples who had been considering marriage for decades, and entrepreneurs who had been evaluating business ideas since they were young adults. The tragedy wasn't that they might make the wrong choice. It was that they were making no choice at all, remaining trapped in a limbo of perpetual uncertainty. They were spending their lives preparing to live instead of actually living. I developed a simple rule that transformed my relationship with decision-making. Any decision is usually better than no decision. Even if I chose incorrectly, I could learn from the experience and adjust course. But if I never chose at all, I learned nothing and went nowhere. The relief that comes from making decisions is immediate and profound. The moment you commit to a path, your mind stops spinning in circles and starts moving forward. You begin taking action, gathering real-world feedback, and making progress toward your goals. I also learned that decisions don't have to be permanent to be valuable. We can make the best choice available to us today and adjust as new information becomes available. The key is to stop treating every decision as if it's irreversible and start treating decision-making as a skill to be developed and practiced regularly. The greatest gift you can give yourself is the freedom that comes from decisive action. Stop waiting for perfect certainty. It doesn't exist. Make your decisions with courage, implement them with commitment, and trust your ability to adapt and improve along the way. There was a period in my life when I was consumed with worry about a family member's health crisis. I would sit for hours, my mind spinning with worst-case scenarios, imagining every possible tragic outcome. The worry was eating me alive, but I felt helpless to do anything constructive about the situation. One particularly dark evening, I couldn't stand the mental torture any longer. I grabbed my coat and walked outside into the crisp night air. With no destination in mind, I just needed to move. As I walked briskly through the neighborhood, something remarkable happened. The crushing weight of anxiety began to lift from my chest. My racing thoughts slowed to a manageable pace, and for the first time in days I felt like I could breathe freely. That walk taught me something profound. Worried minds require busy hands. When we're trapped in cycles of anxious thinking, the fastest way to break free is through physical action. Any kind of action that forces our bodies and minds to engage with the present moment. I began experimenting with this principle deliberately. Whenever I felt worry overwhelming my rational thinking, I would immediately find something productive to do with my hands. Sometimes I would reorganize my office. Other times I would write letters to friends or tackle household projects I'd been postponing. The specific activity didn't matter as much as the act of doing something tangible and purposeful. The results were consistently remarkable. Physical activity seemed to short-circuit the worry spiral in my brain. When my hands were busy, my mind couldn't sustain the endless loop of anxious thoughts that had been consuming my mental energy. But I discovered an even more powerful antidote to worry: helping other people. During my darkest periods of personal anxiety, I found that focusing on someone else's challenges provided immediate relief from my own mental suffering. It was as if worry and service to others couldn't coexist in the same mental space. I remember one particularly difficult week when I was overwhelmed with financial concerns about my business. Instead of sitting at home brooding about my problems, I volunteered to help a neighbor who was struggling to move his elderly mother to a new apartment. For 4 hours, I was completely absorbed in solving logistics, lifting furniture, and providing emotional support to someone who needed it more than I needed to worry about my bank account. When I returned home that evening, my financial situation hadn't changed, but my perspective had transformed completely. My problems seemed smaller and more manageable. More importantly, I had remembered that I was capable of taking constructive action instead of just mental hand-wringing. This led me to develop what I called worry prescriptions, specific activities I would prescribe to myself and my students when anxiety threatened to overwhelm productive thinking. For mild worry, I prescribed organizing activities like cleaning desk drawers or filing papers. For moderate anxiety, I recommended creative projects like writing or learning new skills. For severe worry, I prescribed service activities, helping others who were facing greater challenges than our own. I also discovered the power of routine in combating worry. When I established regular daily habits, morning exercises, scheduled work blocks, evening reading time, I created a structure that left less space for anxious thoughts to take root. Worry thrives in unstructured time, but it struggles to survive in an environment of purposeful activity and consistent routine. The most important insight I gained was that worry is often a substitute for action. When we don't know what to do about a problem, we worry about it instead of addressing it directly. But worry is never a solution. It's just mental spinning that prevents us from finding real solutions. I learned to ask myself a crucial question. Whenever worry began to consume my thoughts, what constructive action can I take right now? Sometimes the answer was research. Sometimes it was having a difficult conversation. Sometimes it was seeking professional help. But there was always something I could do that was more productive than worrying. The beauty of this approach is that it works even when the action doesn't solve the underlying problem. The act of doing something constructive breaks the worry cycle and restores our sense of personal power and agency. Instead of feeling like victims of our circumstances, we become active participants in shaping our lives. Physical activity, service to others, and purposeful routine became my trinity of tools for transforming worried energy into productive energy. These weren't just distractions from worry. They were fundamental shifts in how I chose to engage with life's inevitable challenges. For 3 years, I carried a grudge that poisoned every aspect of my life. A business associate had betrayed my trust in a way that cost me not only money, but also damaged my reputation in our industry. I was consumed with thoughts of revenge, plotting ways to expose his dishonesty and make him pay for what he had done to me. I kept a mental list of his transgressions, rehearsing the story of his betrayal to anyone who would listen. I spent countless hours imagining scenarios where justice would be served and he would suffer the consequences of his actions. I convinced myself that seeking revenge was not only justified but necessary to restore my honor and prevent him from hurting others. What I didn't realize was that my thirst for revenge was destroying me more effectively than his original betrayal ever could. Every moment I spent plotting against him was a moment stolen from building my own future. Every conversation where I rehashed his wrongs was energy that could have been invested in new opportunities and relationships. The turning point came during a sleepless night when I was rehearsing yet another imaginary confrontation with this man. Suddenly, I saw myself clearly, a successful businessman reduced to lying awake at 3 a.m, consumed with hatred for someone who was probably sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the mental torment he was causing me. In that moment of clarity, I realized I had become my own worst enemy. My desire for revenge had turned me into exactly the kind of person I despised, bitter angry, and obsessed with the past instead of focused on the future. I was letting him live rent-free in my head, and the only person suffering from this arrangement was me. I made a decision that night that changed everything. I would forgive him, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved to be free from the prison of resentment I had built around myself. I wrote his name on a piece of paper along with a simple statement, "I forgive you and release myself from this burden." Then I tore up the paper and threw it away. The relief was immediate and profound. It was as if I had been carrying a heavy backpack for years and had finally set it down. The mental space that had been occupied by thoughts of revenge suddenly became available for creativity, planning, and positive relationships. I felt like I had been holding my breath for 3 years and could finally exhale. But the most surprising discovery was what happened to my former enemy. When I stopped investing emotional energy in hating him, he seemed to lose all power over my life. The man who had loomed so large in my thoughts became just another person going about his business, completely irrelevant to my success or happiness. Began studying this phenomenon in others and found the same pattern everywhere. People who held grudges were inevitably more damaged by their resentment than their original grievances had ever been. The desire for revenge was like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You're the one who gets burned. I met a woman who had spent 20 years hating her ex-husband for leaving her. She had poured her energy into making him miserable through legal battles and turning their children against him. Meanwhile, he had remarried, built a successful business, and was living a happy life. Her revenge had accomplished nothing except robbing her of 2 decades' potential joy and peace. I encountered a man who had been passed over for a promotion and spent 10 years trying to sabotage his former colleague's career. While he plotted and schemed, his target advanced to even higher positions, completely unaware of the vendetta against him. The man seeking revenge had stagnated in his career, consumed by bitterness instead of focused on his own advancement. These stories taught me that revenge is always a losing proposition. Even when we succeed in hurting someone who hurt us, the victory is hollow and temporary. The habit of revenge thinking becomes a poison that seeps into every aspect of our lives, making us suspicious, angry, and unable to trust or form healthy relationships. I developed a simple practice that transformed my relationship with those who had wronged me. I began wishing them well, not because they deserved it, but because holding on to resentment was toxic to my own well-being. When thoughts of past grievances arose, I would consciously redirect my mental energy toward gratitude for the lessons I had learned and excitement about my future opportunities. The greatest revenge against those who hurt you is to live a successful, happy life despite their actions. When you free yourself from the burden of resentment, you reclaim your power and your peace of mind. You become unstoppable because nothing from your past can hold you back from your future. One afternoon, I found myself sitting across from an insurance actuary, a man whose entire profession revolved around calculating risk and probability. I had been struggling with anxiety about a series of what-if scenarios that were keeping me awake at night, and I thought perhaps someone who dealt with statistics professionally might offer me a different perspective. "Mr. Carnegie," he said, pulling out a thick book of actuarial tables, "let me show you something that might change how you think about your worries." He opened to a page filled with columns of numbers and percentages. "Do you see these figures? They represent the actual probability of various events that people commonly fear." As he walked me through the statistics, I was astounded. The chances of being in a serious car accident were far lower than I had imagined. The probability of a house fire was minuscule. The likelihood of serious injury from air travel was so small it was barely measurable. Yet these were exactly the kinds of catastrophes that occupied my worried mind during sleepless nights. Most people, the actuary explained, vastly overestimate the probability of dramatic negative events while underestimating their ability to handle ordinary challenges. They prepare for earthquakes while ignoring the small daily problems that actually shape their lives. This conversation sparked a revelation that would fundamentally change my approach to worry. I realized that most of my anxieties were based on emotional probability rather than mathematical probability. I was giving equal mental weight to outcomes that had a 1% chance of occurring and those that had a 90% chance of happening. I began applying this statistical thinking to my personal fears. When I worried about my business failing completely, I forced myself to look at the actual data. What percentage of established businesses in my industry failed catastrophically within a given year? The number was surprisingly low. What percentage faced temporary setbacks that required adjustments? Much higher, but manageable. This analysis didn't eliminate all my concerns, but it helped me allocate my mental energy more rationally. Instead of spending sleepless nights preparing for the 2% chance of total business failure, I could focus my planning on the 40% chance of needing to adapt to changing market conditions. I started teaching this principle to my students through what I called probability reality checks. When someone came to me paralyzed by fear of a specific catastrophe, I would ask them to research the actual statistical likelihood of their feared outcome. Time and again, they discovered that their emotional estimation of risk was wildly disproportionate to the mathematical reality. One student was terrified of public speaking because she was convinced she would forget her entire presentation and humiliate herself completely. When I asked her to research how often this actually happened to prepared speakers, she found that total mental blanks were extremely rare, while minor stumbles and recoveries were common and quickly forgotten by audiences. Another student was paralyzed by fear of investing any money because he was certain the stock market would crash and wipe out his savings. When we looked at historical data over long time periods, he discovered that while short-term volatility was normal, the probability of long-term growth for diversified investments was quite high. The key insight was learning to distinguish between possible and probable. Yes, it's possible that any number of catastrophic events could occur, but the probability of most of our worst fears actualizing is much lower than our anxious minds would have us believe. I also learned to flip this principle and apply it to positive outcomes. If I was statistically overestimating negative possibilities, perhaps I was underestimating positive ones. When I researched the probability of success for people who consistently applied effort and learning to their goals, the numbers were encouraging. Most people who persevered through initial setbacks eventually achieved significant progress toward their objectives. This statistical perspective became one of my most powerful tools for maintaining emotional equilibrium. When worry began to consume my thoughts, I would ask myself, what are the actual odds of this feared outcome occurring? More often than not, the mathematical reality was far less frightening than my emotional imagination. The law of averages taught me that while we cannot eliminate all risk from life, we can calibrate our responses to match actual probabilities, rather than imaginary ones. This allows us to prepare sensibly for likely challenges while refusing to waste mental energy on statistical improbabilities that may never occur. There was a time when my life felt like a whirlwind of chaos, and I couldn't understand why I felt constantly anxious despite having no major crises to deal with. My desk was buried under stacks of unopened mail, half-finished projects, and random notes scribbled on scraps of paper. My schedule was a maze of conflicting commitments and forgotten appointments. My mind jumped from one unfinished task to another, never able to focus completely on anything. The breaking point came when I missed an important speaking engagement because I had written it down on 3 different pieces of paper with 3 different times, and I couldn't remember which. One was correct. Standing in my cluttered office, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my mental disorganization, I realized that my external chaos was creating internal turmoil. That night, I made a radical decision. I would bring order to my environment and see if it brought peace to my mind. I started with my desk, creating specific places for specific types of items. Incoming mail went in one basket, outgoing correspondence in another. Current projects had their own folders and reference materials were filed systematically. The Pacha effect was immediate and surprising. As my workspace became organized, my thinking became clearer. When I could find what I needed quickly, I felt more confident and in control. When everything had its proper place, my mind could focus on creative work instead of constantly searching for misplaced items. But the real transformation came when I applied this principle to organizing my thoughts and priorities. I developed a simple system for capturing and organizing all the mental clutter that had been swirling around in my head. Every evening, I would write down all the tasks, ideas, and concerns that were occupying my mental space, then organize them into categories: things to do tomorrow, things to do this week, things to delegate, and things to let go of entirely. This mental filing system had a profound effect on my peace of mind. Instead of carrying dozens of random worries and to-do items in my head all day, I could trust that everything important was captured and organized in my system. My mind was free to focus on the task at hand instead of trying to remember everything else I needed to do. I discovered that much of what we call stress is actually the mental fatigue that comes from trying to keep track of too many things without a reliable system. When our minds are cluttered with unorganized information, we feel overwhelmed even when our actual workload is manageable. One of my students, a busy executive, told me he felt constantly behind and anxious despite working long hours. When I visited his office, I found papers scattered across every surface, important documents mixed with outdated materials, and no clear system for prioritizing his numerous responsibilities. We spent an afternoon organizing his workspace and creating simple systems for managing his daily tasks. 2 weeks later, he reported that his stress level had dropped dramatically, even though his workload hadn't changed. "I can actually think clearly now," he told me. "When my environment is organized, my mind feels organized too." I began teaching this principle to everyone who would listen. External order creates internal calm. When our physical environment is cluttered and chaotic, our mental environment tends to mirror that disorder. But when we create systems and structures in our external world, our inner world naturally becomes more peaceful and focused. This principle extends beyond just physical organization to include our daily routines and habits. I found that having consistent routines for important activities, morning preparation, work transitions, evening wind down, created a sense of stability and predictability that reduced anxiety significantly. The key insight was that organization isn't about perfectionism or rigid control. It's about creating reliable systems that free our minds to focus on what matters most. When we don't have to spend mental energy remembering where things are or what we need to do next, we can invest that energy in creative thinking and meaningful work. I also learned that maintaining order requires ongoing attention, not just one-time organization efforts. I developed the habit of spending 10 minutes each evening, returning things to their proper places, and 10 minutes each morning reviewing my priorities for the day. These small daily investments in order paid enormous dividends and reduced stress and increased productivity. The transformation from chaos to order isn't just about efficiency. It's about creating an environment where peace of mind can flourish. When your external world is organized, your internal world naturally follows suit. I was having one of the worst days of my life. A major client had canceled a lucrative contract, my car had broken down on the way to an important meeting, and I had received news that a close friend was seriously ill. By evening, I was drowning in self-pity and convinced that life was conspiring against me. As I sat in my apartment that night, wallowing in my misfortunes, my eyes fell on a letter from a former student. She wrote to thank me for a course I had taught 2 years earlier, crediting it with helping her overcome crippling social anxiety and build the confidence to start her own business. She included a photo of herself at the grand opening of her store, beaming with pride and surrounded by family and friends. In that moment, something shifted in my perspective. Here I was, feeling sorry for myself over temporary setbacks, while this woman was celebrating a life-changing transformation that I had played a small part in creating. I realized I had been so focused on what was going wrong that I had completely lost sight of what was going right in my life. That night, I started what would become a 30-year practice, writing down 3 things I was grateful for before going to sleep. Not big, dramatic things, but simple daily blessings that I had been taking for granted. The first night I wrote, "I'm grateful for a warm apartment, for food in my refrigerator, and for the ability to help others through my work." The effect was subtle, but immediate. Instead of falling asleep rehearsing my problems, I drifted off, thinking about positive aspects of my life. I woke up the next morning with a different attitude, more resilient and optimistic than I had felt in weeks. As I continued this practice, I began to notice a fundamental shift in how I experienced daily life. Instead of automatically focusing on what was missing or wrong, I started actively looking for things to appreciate. This wasn't about denying problems or pretending difficulties didn't exist. It was about maintaining a balanced perspective that included both challenges and blessings. I discovered that gratitude works like a mental muscle. The more you exercise it, the stronger it becomes. After several months of nightly gratitude practice, I found myself naturally noticing positive things throughout the day. A student's breakthrough in confidence, a beautiful sunset on my walk home, a kind gesture from a stranger. These moments of appreciation began to accumulate and shift my overall emotional state. One of the most powerful aspects of this practice was how it changed my relationship with problems. When I regularly acknowledged the good things in my life, difficulties seemed less overwhelming and more manageable. I still faced the same challenges, but they no longer had the power to eclipse everything positive in my experience. I began teaching this principle to my students, many of whom were trapped in cycles of complaint and dissatisfaction. I challenged them to keep gratitude journals for just 1 week, writing down 3 specific things they appreciated each day. The results were remarkable. A businessman who had been consumed with resentment about his demanding job began noticing the security it provided for his family and the skills he was developing. A woman who complained constantly about her difficult neighbors started appreciating her comfortable home and quiet neighborhood. A student struggling with financial pressures began recognizing the education he was receiving and the opportunities it would create. The transformation wasn't that their problems disappeared, but that their problems no longer dominated their entire experience of life. They had developed what I called gratitude vision, the ability to see blessings alongside burdens, to notice what was working while acknowledging what needed improvement. I also learned that gratitude is particularly powerful when applied to difficult people and challenging situations. Instead of focusing only on what frustrated me about certain individuals, I began looking for qualities I could appreciate. This didn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior, but it prevented me from developing the kind of bitter resentment that poisons one's own peace of mind. During my most difficult periods, I would challenge myself to find something to be grateful for within the very situation that was causing me stress. When facing financial pressures, I appreciated the motivation it gave me to be creative and resourceful. When dealing with difficult people, I was grateful for the patience and wisdom these interactions were teaching me. The habit of gratitude became my most reliable antidote to worry and stress. No matter how challenging my circumstances, I could always find something to appreciate, and that appreciation became an anchor that kept me from being swept away by anxiety and despair. The first time I stood before an audience to give a speech, my hands shook so violently I couldn't hold my notes steady. My voice cracked like a teenage boy's. My mind went completely blank, and I stumbled through my presentation like a man walking across a frozen pond, terrified that each step might send me crashing through the ice of my own inadequacy. That humiliating experience could have ended my speaking career before it began, but instead, it taught me something crucial about the nature of confidence. It isn't something you're born with or without. It's something you build, brick by brick, through deliberate practice and progressive challenges. I realized that my lack of confidence wasn't just hurting my professional prospects. It was the root cause of most of my anxiety and worry. When I didn't believe in my own abilities, every challenge felt like a potential catastrophe. Every setback seemed like proof of my inadequacy, and every opportunity appeared too risky to pursue. That's when I developed what I came to call my confidence-building campaign, a systematic approach to developing unshakable self-belief through small, incremental victories. Instead of trying to transform overnight from a nervous wreck into a polished speaker, I would take on progressively more challenging situations, building my confidence one small success at a time. I started by speaking to groups of just 3 or 4 people about topics I knew well. The stakes were low, the audience was friendly, and I could practice my skills without the pressure of a formal presentation. When I succeeded at this level, I moved up to slightly larger groups, then more challenging topics, then less familiar audiences. Each small victory deposited confidence in what I thought of as my self-belief bank account. The more positive experiences I accumulated, the more I could draw on that stored confidence when facing new challenges. Instead of approaching each opportunity with the fear that I might fail, I could approach it with evidence that I had succeeded before and could succeed again. But the real breakthrough came when I realized that confidence isn't about never feeling afraid. It's about feeling afraid and acting anyway. I learned to distinguish between courage and the absence of fear. Courage is what you demonstrate when you're terrified, but take action despite your terror. I remember a particular speaking engagement where I was asked to address a hostile audience that disagreed with my message. My old instinct would have been to decline or to worry myself sick before the event. Instead, I prepared thoroughly, acknowledged my nervousness as normal, and walked onto that stage determined to serve my audience regardless of their initial resistance. The presentation wasn't perfect, and not everyone was convinced by my message. But I had proven to myself that I could handle a difficult situation with grace and competence. That experience became another deposit in my confidence account, making the next challenge easier to face. I discovered that confidence is largely about changing your relationship with failure. Instead of seeing mistakes as evidence of incompetence, I learned to view them as tuition payments in the University of Experience. Every failure taught me something valuable that made me more capable of succeeding in the future. This perspective transformed how I approached new opportunities. Instead of asking, "What if I fail?" I started asking, "What will I learn?" Instead of focusing on what could go wrong, I concentrated on what I would gain from the experience, regardless of the outcome. I began teaching this principle to my students through what I called courage assignments, specific challenges designed to stretch their comfort zones in manageable increments. A shy student might be asked to strike up one conversation with a stranger each day. Someone afraid of public speaking might practice giving 1-minute presentations to their family members. The key was making the challenges difficult enough to require courage, but achievable enough to create success. Each completed assignment built evidence that they were braver and more capable than they had previously believed. I also learned that confidence is contagious and cumulative. When you develop genuine self-belief in one area of your life, it tends to spill over into other areas. The student who learns to speak confidently in public often discovers they can also negotiate more effectively, lead with greater authority, and take on challenges they previously would have avoided. The transformation from fear-based living to confidence-based living is one of the most profound changes a person can make. When you truly believe in your ability to handle whatever life brings, worry loses most of its power over you. You stop being paralyzed by what might go wrong and start being excited by what might go right. I used to carry my stress in my shoulders. Like a heavy yoke, my jaw clenched so tightly that I would wake up with headaches, and my entire body wound like a spring, ready to snap. I thought this physical tension was just an inevitable part of being a driven, ambitious person. I wore my stress like a badge of honor, believing that constant tension was proof of how seriously I took my responsibilities. The wake-up call came during a particularly demanding period when I was traveling extensively, teaching multiple courses, and trying to write my first book simultaneously. I was pushing myself relentlessly, and my body was paying the price. One morning, I caught my reflection in a hotel mirror and barely recognized the tense, haggard man staring back at me. That's when I realized something crucial. Physical tension and mental worry feed off each other in a vicious cycle. When my body was tense, my mind became more anxious. When my mind was worried, my body became more rigid. I was trapped in a pattern that was destroying both my health and my peace of mind. I began studying the connection between physical relaxation and mental calm, and what I discovered revolutionized my approach to managing stress. I learned that we cannot be mentally agitated when our bodies are truly relaxed, and conversely, we cannot maintain physical tension when our minds are at peace. I developed a simple but powerful technique that I could use anywhere, anytime. Starting with my feet and working up to my head, I would consciously relax each muscle group in my body. I would focus on my toes first, deliberately releasing any tension I found there, then move to my calves, thighs, abdomen, chest, shoulders, arms, hands, neck, jaw, and finally, my facial muscles. The first time I practiced this technique thoroughly, I was amazed by how much tension I had been carrying without even realizing it. My shoulders, which I thought were already relaxed, dropped by what felt like inches. My jaw, which I believed was loose, released with an audible sigh. My entire body seemed to expand and settle into a state of comfort I hadn't experienced in years. But the real surprise was what happened to my mind. As my body relaxed, my mental anxiety melted away as well. Problems that had seemed overwhelming just minutes earlier now appeared manageable. Worries that had been spinning in my head like hamsters on a wheel simply stopped their frantic activity. I began incorporating this relaxation practice into my daily routine. Every evening before sleep, I would spend 10 minutes systematically relaxing my entire body. During stressful moments throughout the day, I would take just 60 seconds to release tension from my shoulders and jaw. Before important presentations or meetings, I would use this technique to calm both my nerves and my physical presence. The results extended far beyond stress relief. When I was physically relaxed, I could think more clearly, speak more articulately, and respond to challenges with greater wisdom and composure. I discovered that relaxation wasn't a luxury or a sign of laziness. It was a performance enhancer that made me more effective in every aspect of my life. I started teaching this principle to my students, many of whom were surprised to discover how much physical tension they were carrying unnecessarily. A businessman realized he had been clenching his jaw during every meeting, creating headaches and giving him an aggressive appearance that undermined his relationships with colleagues. A teacher discovered that she held her breath whenever students asked difficult questions, which made her voice tight and her answers rushed. When she learned to breathe deeply and relax her body, she found she could respond more thoughtfully and connect better with her students. The key insight was that relaxation is a skill that requires practice, just like any other valuable ability. Most people wait until they're overwhelmed with stress before trying to relax, but by then, The tension has become so ingrained that it's difficult to release. The secret is to practice relaxation regularly when you're not stressed, so it becomes an automatic response you can access when you need it most. I also learned the importance of scheduling relaxation just as seriously as I scheduled work commitments. I blocked out time for walks in nature, for reading purely for pleasure, and for activities that brought me joy without any productive purpose. These weren't indulgences. They were investments in my long-term effectiveness and well-being. The art of relaxation taught me that we cannot muscle our way through life's challenges with constant tension and force. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is to stop pushing, release our grip, and allow solutions to emerge from a place of calm clarity rather than anxious struggle. For years, I was obsessed with time management. I filled every minute of my schedule believing that maximum productivity came from maximum activity. I carried pocket watches, made detailed schedules, and prided myself on never wasting a moment. Yet, despite all this careful time management, I often felt exhausted, overwhelmed, and strangely unproductive. The revelation came during a conversation with a remarkably successful businessman who seemed to accomplish twice as much as I did while appearing relaxed and energetic. When I asked him about his time management secrets, he laughed and said, "Dale, I don't manage time. I manage energy. Time is the same for everyone, but energy varies dramatically based on how you choose to spend it." That simple statement turned my entire approach to productivity upside down. I began paying attention not just to how I spent my time, but to how different activities affected my energy levels. What I discovered was both surprising and transformative. I noticed that some activities, even when they were productive and important, drained my energy like a leak in a bucket. Lengthy meetings where I felt unheard, administrative tasks that required no creativity, and interactions with chronically negative people left me feeling depleted regardless of how much I accomplished. Conversely, certain activities seemed to energize me even when they required significant effort. Teaching enthusiastic students, working on creative projects, and having meaningful conversations with inspiring people actually increased my energy levels. After these activities, I felt more capable of tackling challenging tasks rather than less. I started keeping what I called an energy audit, a simple log of how different activities, people, and environments affected my vitality throughout the day. The patterns that emerged were eye-opening. I discovered that worry was the single greatest drain on my energy, consuming mental and emotional resources faster than any physical activity ever could. When I spent an hour worrying about a potential problem, I felt more exhausted than after teaching a 3-hour course. When I allowed myself to get caught up in office gossip or complaints, I would need twice as long to complete simple tasks that normally required minimal effort. This insight led me to completely reorganize my approach to productivity. Instead of trying to cram more activities into my schedule, I began ruthlessly eliminating energy drains and increasing energy gains. I started declining social obligations that left me feeling depleted, even when they seemed important or prestigious. Restructured my daily routine to align with my natural energy rhythms. I scheduled my most challenging creative work during my peak energy hours and relegated routine administrative tasks to times when my energy was naturally lower. I discovered that 2 hours of focused work during my energy peak was worth 6 hours of scattered effort during low energy periods. Most importantly, I learned to say no to requests that would drain my energy without providing corresponding value. This wasn't about being selfish. It was about preserving my resources so I could give my best effort to the commitments that truly mattered. I began teaching this principle to my students, many of whom were burning themselves out through poor energy management despite excellent time management. A teacher realized she was spending too much time with colleagues who constantly complained about their jobs, leaving her feeling negative and drained before she even entered her classroom. A businessman discovered that checking emails first thing in the morning when his creative energy was highest was sabotaging his ability to work on important projects later in the day. By shifting email to a lower energy time and protecting his peak hours for strategic thinking, his productivity soared. The transformation from time-focused to energy-focused living was profound. When I learned to guard my energy as carefully as I guarded my time, I found I could accomplish more while feeling less stressed. I had more resilience for handling unexpected challenges because I wasn't constantly running on empty. I also discovered that high energy is the best antidote to worry and anxiety. When my energy levels were strong, problems seemed manageable and solutions came naturally. But when I was depleted, even small challenges felt overwhelming, and my mind would spiral into worry and catastrophic thinking. Energy management taught me that sustainability matters more than intensity. It's better to work at 80% capacity consistently than to alternate between 100% effort and complete burnout. By preserving and strategically deploying my energy, I could maintain high performance over the long term without sacrificing my health or peace of mind. One of my greatest sources of anxiety used to be my relationships with other people. I worried constantly about what others thought of me, whether I had offended someone with a careless comment, or if a colleague's distant behavior meant they were upset with me. I would replay conversations in my head, analyzing every word for hidden meanings and potential problems. The breakthrough came when I realized that relationship stress was multiplying every other worry in my life. When I was fighting with my business partner, financial concerns felt catastrophic. When I was having tension with a family member, professional setbacks seemed insurmountable. Conversely, when my relationships were harmonious, I could handle almost any other challenge with equanimity. This led me to study the principles of building what I called worry-proof relationships, connections that provided support and stability rather than adding stress and anxiety to my life. What I discovered transformed not only my personal happiness, but also my professional effectiveness. The first principle I learned was the futility of trying to change other people. I had spent years exhausting myself, trying to convince difficult individuals to see things my way, to be more reasonable, or to treat me with the respect I thought I deserved. This approach created constant conflict and anxiety because I was trying to control something completely outside my power. I developed a new strategy. Instead of trying to change others, I would focus on changing my own responses to them. I couldn't control whether my business partner was moody and unpredictable, but I could control whether I took his moods personally or let them affect my peace of mind. The second principle was learning to choose my battles wisely. I realized that most conflicts aren't worth the energy they consume. Being right in an argument often costs more than being wrong would have. I started asking myself, will this matter in 5 years? Will winning this argument improve my life or relationships? Is this worth the stress it's creating? More often than not, the answer was no. I began letting people have their victories in small matters so I could focus my energy on issues that truly mattered. This didn't mean becoming a doormat. It meant being strategic about when and how I chose to assert myself. The third principle was the power of genuine appreciation. Discovered that most relationship problems stem from people feeling unvalued and unappreciated. When I made a conscious effort to notice and acknowledge the positive qualities in others, their behavior toward me improved dramatically. A colleague who had been difficult and combative became cooperative and supportive when I started recognizing his expertise and thanking him for his contributions. A family member who had been distant and critical became warm and encouraging when I began expressing genuine gratitude for the ways they had helped me over the years. I learned that appreciation must be specific and sincere to be effective. Instead of generic compliments, I would point out particular actions or qualities that I genuinely valued. This created a positive cycle where people felt seen and valued, which motivated them to continue the behaviors I appreciated. The fourth principle was establishing clear boundaries without creating enemies. I discovered that many relationship conflicts arise from unclear expectations and boundaries. People can't respect limits they don't know exist, and they can't meet standards that have never been communicated. I learned to be direct but kind in expressing my needs and limits. Instead of hoping people would intuitively understand what I wanted, I would clearly but respectfully communicate my expectations. This prevented the resentment that builds when we expect others to read our minds. The fifth principle was accepting that some relationships will always require more energy than they provide. Instead of trying to fix these connections, I learned to limit my exposure to consistently draining people while maintaining basic courtesy and professionalism. This didn't mean cutting people out of my life completely, but it did mean protecting my energy by limiting the time and emotional investment I put into relationships that were consistently negative or demanding. I also discovered the importance of building a support network of positive, encouraging relationships that could sustain me during difficult times. When I had strong connections with people who believed in me and supported my goals, I was much more resilient in dealing with challenging individuals and situations. The transformation in my stress levels was remarkable. When my relationships became sources of support rather than anxiety, I found I could handle professional and personal challenges with much greater calm and confidence. Good relationships became my buffer against life's inevitable storms, the ultimate test of everything. I had learned about living without stress, and worry came when I faced the most devastating period of my life. Within the span of 18 months, I lost my closest friend to a sudden heart attack, watched my mother struggle with a debilitating illness, and saw my business nearly collapse during an economic downturn that seemed to come from nowhere. Each of these challenges alone would have been enough to test my resilience. Together, they created what felt like a perfect storm designed to destroy everything I had built, both professionally and emotionally. There were days when I wondered if all the principles I had developed and taught were nothing more than pleasant theories that crumbled under the weight of real adversity. The old Dale Carnegie would have been consumed with worry, spinning endless scenarios about how much worse things could get. He would have lost sleep, developed stress-related health problems, and probably made poor decisions from a place of panic and desperation. But the person I had become through years of practicing these principles responded differently. I won't pretend it wasn't difficult, or that I didn't feel the full weight of grief and concern. But instead of being overwhelmed by the challenges, I was able to apply the tools I had developed systematically and purposefully. When my friend died unexpectedly, I used my day-tight compartment philosophy to grieve fully in the present moment. Without letting fears about future losses paralyze me, I allowed myself to feel the pain without adding the burden of worrying about how I would handle similar losses in the future. During my mother's illness, I applied Willis Carrier's formula, accepting the worst-case scenario while focusing all my energy on providing the best possible care and support. Instead of torturing myself with what-if scenarios, I concentrated on being present and helpful during each visit and conversation. When my business faced serious financial difficulties, I used my energy management principles to focus on controllable factors rather than external economic forces I couldn't influence. I prioritized actions that could improve my situation while refusing to waste energy on blame or self-pity. Perhaps most importantly, I relied on the support network of positive relationships I had cultivated over the years. Instead of trying to handle everything alone, I accepted help from friends and colleagues who offered their support. I discovered that strong relationships aren't just pleasant additions to life, they're essential resources during times of crisis. The most powerful realization during this difficult period was that challenges are inevitable, but suffering is largely optional. Pain is unavoidable when we face loss, setbacks, and disappointments, but we can choose whether to compound that natural pain with unnecessary worry, regret, and fear. I learned that resilience isn't about avoiding difficulties, or pretending they don't affect you. True resilience is about developing the tools and perspectives that allow you to navigate challenges without being destroyed by them. It's about maintaining your core stability even when the surface of your life is turbulent. This period also taught me the difference between being optimistic and being realistic. Optimism that ignores genuine problems is just another form of worry. It's anxious energy focused on maintaining a false positive narrative. True peace comes from realistic acceptance of both challenges and opportunities, dealing with problems directly while maintaining hope for the future. I developed what I called my crisis response protocol, a systematic approach to handling major difficulties that prevented me from being overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of challenging situations. This included immediate stress management techniques, clear decision-making processes, and specific steps for maintaining perspective during intense periods. The transformation during this difficult time surprised even me. Instead of feeling like a victim of circumstances, I felt empowered by my ability to respond constructively to whatever life presented. I couldn't control what happened to me, but I had complete control over how I chose to respond. When I emerged from this challenging period, I was stronger and more confident than ever before. Not because the difficulties had somehow been beneficial, but because I had proven to myself that I could handle whatever life might bring without losing my essential peace of mind. The principles I had developed weren't just theories, they were practical tools that worked even under the most demanding circumstances. This gave me unshakable confidence that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I had the resources to face them with courage and dignity. As I sit here today, reflecting on the journey from that anxious farm boy who couldn't sleep for worry to the man I've become, I'm filled with profound gratitude, not just for the destination, but for every step of the path that brought me here. The transformation hasn't been easy, but it has been completely worth every moment of effort and practice. I want you to understand what's possible when you consistently apply these principles to your daily life. You can wake up each morning with a sense of calm anticipation rather than dread about the day ahead. You can face challenges with curiosity and confidence instead of anxiety and fear. You can sleep peacefully at night, knowing that you've done your best with today's opportunities and that tomorrow will bring its own possibilities. The life I live now is not free from problems. No one's life is. I still face setbacks, disappointments, and difficult decisions. The difference is that these challenges no longer have the power to steal my peace of mind or paralyze me with worry. They are simply part of life's rich tapestry, to be handled with the tools and perspectives I've developed over the years. When I receive disappointing news, I automatically apply the day-tight compartment principle, dealing with today's reality without borrowing trouble from tomorrow. When I face a difficult decision, I gather facts efficiently and choose confidently, knowing that any decision is usually better than prolonged indecision. When I encounter difficult people, I focus on what I can control, my own responses and attitudes, rather than trying to change what's beyond my influence. The energy I once wasted on worry is now available for creativity, service, and joy. Instead of lying awake at night rehearsing problems, I use that mental energy for planning positive projects and nurturing meaningful relationships. Instead of being drained by anxiety, I have vitality available for the activities and people that matter most to me. But perhaps the greatest gift of this transformation is the freedom to be fully present in my own life. When you're not constantly worried about yesterday's mistakes or tomorrow's potential problems, you can actually experience today's moments. You can appreciate a beautiful sunset, enjoy a good conversation, and savor simple pleasures without the background noise of chronic anxiety. I've watched thousands of students undergo similar transformations, and each one reinforces my conviction that these principles work for anyone willing to practice them consistently. I've seen shy individuals become confident speakers, worried executives become calm leaders, and anxious parents become peaceful role models for their children. The key is understanding that this transformation doesn't happen overnight. Just as physical fitness requires regular exercise, mental and emotional fitness requires regular practice of these principles. Some days will be easier than others, and there will be times when you slip back into old patterns of worry and stress. This is normal and expected. What matters is getting back to the practices that serve you. Start with one principle that resonates most strongly with you. Perhaps it's the day-tight compartment philosophy, or the three-step problem-solving formula, or the practice of daily gratitude. Apply it consistently for 1 week, paying attention to how it affects your peace of mind and effectiveness. Then, gradually add other principles as they become natural habits. Remember that you're not trying to eliminate all emotions or become robotically calm. The goal is to experience the full range of human feelings without being overwhelmed or paralyzed by them. You want to feel appropriate concern without destructive worry, healthy ambition without chronic stress, and genuine sadness without consuming despair. Your new life without stress and worry is waiting for you. But it requires one thing: action. All the understanding in the world won't change your experience until you begin practicing these principles in your daily life. Start today, start small, but start now. You have everything you need to live with confidence, peace, and joy, regardless of what circumstances you may face. The power to transform your relationship with stress and worry lies entirely within your hands. Use it and discover the remarkable life that's possible when you're free from the tyranny of chronic anxiety. The farm boy from Missouri never could have imagined the life I live today. Neither can you fully imagine what's possible when you commit to these practices. But I promise you this: the journey toward a life without stress and worry is the most worthwhile adventure you'll ever undertake.